As we approach the NHL All-Star break, many NHL teams are deciding whether or not they're going to be buyers or sellers and what their playoff fate likely holds for this season. Today we're looking at some trade rumors ahead of the deadline, focusing on the Montreal Canadiens, the Carolina Hurricanes, the San Jose Sharks, LA Kings, and Anaheim Ducks. We'll jump into all the latest news coming up next. Welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we're kind of heading into a slowdown period for the NHL. Many teams are on their bye week right now, and the All-Star break is not very far away. So we're actually going to have a little bit of a stretch with limited NHL action. Many of these NHL teams are kind of deciding what their fate will be at the deadline. As we're approaching about the 1 month mark away now, teams need to decide if they're going to be buyers or sellers and what players might be available. Now, let's kick things off with the three teams in California, and I want to start with the Anaheim Ducks. Now, the Ducks actually got off to a decent start this season, but slowly came back down to normal here and have slowly been realizing that maybe they need more of a rebuild than a retool. Of course, we saw them buy out veteran Corey Perry during the offseason, and now they need to continue moving out veterans and moving in some younger pieces into the mix here. Now, unfortunately for the Anaheim Ducks, a lot of their prospects have not taken the necessary steps this year to make them more competitive. They were really relying on some of these players to play bigger roles. We're talking about guys like Max Comtois, Sam Steele, Troy Terry, just to name a few. They still have bright futures, but they haven't progressed enough this year to really take on big roles within the team. It appears the Ducks might be heading more towards a rebuild. The one name that's surfaced in a rumor mill that might be available to try to lend more picks and prospects into the organization would be 28-year-old defenseman Josh Manson. Now, Manson still has a few years left on his contract. It's a reasonable amount. He can certainly play a physical game, a defensive game, a little bit of offense. Certainly a pretty decent rear guard for sure. And might be made available to kind of restock the cupboards for the Ducks. If you look around their roster, some of their other players that might be a little bit older might not really have a whole lot of value. But Manson's at that age of his career where he's, has a couple of years left for term on his contract. So he still has some higher value, especially before that contract expires. Now, of course, there's plenty of teams been rumored out there looking for defense. There's always teams looking to add on a blue line before the NHL deadline, and Manson could certainly be a top 4 on many teams, top 6 on contenders for sure. Like I said, and his contract fits well with a lot of teams too. Like there's all kinds of teams out there that we've discussed before that are looking for D, so we very well could see a guy like Manson on the move. Now, of course, a bigger name in Anaheim like a Ryan Getzlaf, for example, I wouldn't think would be moved this year with the contract that he has. Perhaps next year. Getzlaf's heading into the final year of his contract next year, so of course he could be used as a rental this time next season, but I wouldn't think anybody else like him would be somebody that they would move now. I mean, other guys that are still young enough like Silverberg and Raquel appear to be players they want to build around. As I mentioned as well, some of their other younger prospects as well, they still have bright futures, and they're certainly hoping that they can take more steps and take on bigger roles with the team next year. They've got a solid goalie in John Gibson, so they do have a lot of good foundational pieces in place in Anaheim, but they really need to go into a rebuild here. Now, of course, the 2020 draft is going to be well stocked with all kinds of great talent. The Anaheim Ducks are likely going to have a pretty decent pick. We'll see how much luck they have in the draft lottery, but getting a high pick would certainly go a long way to help them accelerate a rebuild. Now let's jump over and take a look at the rival here in California, the San Jose Sharks. Now, the Sharks are having a very down season, certainly far below expectations for sure, and they have a lot of veteran guys who very well could find themselves moved before the NHL trade deadline. There's been noted in a few sources and a few articles I've come across saying that GM Doug Wilson feels embarrassed that he does not have his first round pick, that it had to be included in the trade to acquire Erik Karlsson a little over 1 season ago. So it's really unfortunate for the Sharks, but of course the Senators found themselves in this exact same situation not long ago where they gave up their first round pick at Duchesne trade, and then things really went off the rails, and they really could have used that first round pick but had to give up one or the other to the Avalanche between 2018 and 2019. Of course, they selected Brady Tkachuk and gave up the 2019 pick instead. So either way, it was going to hurt, but Tkachuk's worked out nicely for them, and now they very well might be able to make up for that by having 2 high picks due to the falters here for the Sharks. So it's really unfortunate. They don't have a great prospect system, in my opinion. They do have a few prospects who look promising, but not a very deep pool compared to some of the other teams around the NHL. They don't have their first round pick, but the Sharks are likely going to be treating this like they did a few years back. The last time they missed the playoffs, they bounced back the next year, made the playoffs, and went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. So I think Wilson's going to be looking to do a bit of a reset here. But there's certainly some interesting names on the Sharks roster that could be up for grabs for a trade to NHL deadline, including defenseman Brendan Dillon. Certainly could provide a lot of depth to other teams, some sandpaper defensive help, like I mentioned about Josh Manson. Certainly the type of player who's going to be highly sought after. If you got Melker Karlsson as well, who's been a pretty solid bottom six guy, good penalty killer as well. And I can't help but wonder what this might mean for veterans Joe Thornton and Patrick Marleau. Now, neither one of them have very expensive contracts. They're both getting up there in years, both still chasing that first ever Stanley Cup. And with the Sharks appearing to be pretty much out of it here, would they consider moving on if a team would have them to go chase a Stanley Cup? It certainly can't help but wonder if that's a possible scenario that we might see unfold here. There hasn't really been anything in the rumor mill in regards to those guys being on the market or teams inquiring about their services. It's just my opinion on something that I think we should be monitoring here. If I were those guys, I'd probably be looking to chase a Stanley Cup, as it very well could be the end of their career. I know for each of them, we've been kind of saying it here for a while, especially Thornton, where he's been on shorter term contracts the last few years, that this very well could be the end of the road. It's hard to say if they'd be back next year or if the Sharks want to continue having them in their plans beyond the current season or not. So that's certainly another situation in San Jose to watch unfold. Like I said, they're definitely going to be sellers. Just a matter of who goes and who stays and how GM Doug Wilson tries to orchestrate this reset for next year. But I do think a big part of what the reset needs to include is goaltending, and that's not going to be easy to do. Now, fortunately, I guess one situation, Aaron Dell is a pending UFA, so moving him out if they wanted to would be a little bit easier. Not sure if he'd be a deadline acquisition or not, because there's a few other goaltenders that very well likely would go ahead of him should they be available. But still, Martin Jones is the problematic situation here, still having a number of years on his contract and not playing well for the last number of years either. Certainly has not worked out for Jones in San Jose. So we'll see how GM Doug Wilson appears to reset his team and go forth into the offseason. Now jumping over, take a look at the LA Kings, the last California team here. Pretty much everybody on the roster that's not named Anze Kopitar or Drew Doughty appears to be available by GM Rob Blake as we approach the deadline. There could be several players exit this team, and at the same time there very well might be some stick around. It really boils down to interest from other clubs and what kind of offers Rob Blake is going to be entertaining here. Now, a couple of names that have come up more recently that very well could prove interesting would be a guy like Jeff Carter, who's 35 years old, center iceman, proven 30-goal guy in the past, more of a 20-goal scorer now, still relatively productive, has been relatively healthy off and on. I think he could very well be a help, but of course he does have a little bit more term on his contract. It was previously reported in the last year or so, because his name has surfaced before, that if he were traded that he would up and retire, but he denied those rumors and says he would continue playing, and he's kind of waiting to see what happens here as the deadline approaches. But Carter is a player I think who could be a good help to some teams, but if anything scares them off, it would be the remaining term on the contract. If he was closer to the end of it, I would think it'd be more a possibility, but his name has surfaced again lately. I'm not really sure we're going to see that. I can see some teams maybe sniffing around. If the Kings were able to retain enough salary, then perhaps we could see it happen. But there's certainly some guys on the back end as well on their blue line, like Forbort, as well as Ryan, even Alec Martinez. Now, Martinez has a year left on his deal, but on many other occasions, would not be surprising to see him move like we saw with Jake Muzzin over to the Leafs last year. He still had an extra year in his deal, and I can see a similar type of situation unfolding there. Even other role players like Trevor Lewis and Colin Clifford, proven bottom six forwards, good character guys, good in the room, can play a variety of roles. PK, they have that championship caliber to their name now after being part of a few Stanley Cup championships with the Kings. I can see them being highly sought after and maybe even generate as much as maybe a second round pick or a prospect in return for their services. I know a team like Pittsburgh kind of jumps out who might need some depth at the forward position after all the injuries they've encountered this year. I can see that be of interest to them, and they're certainly well attuned to having these role players come in and play solid roles for them. So I think they would be a good fit there amongst other teams too. But I think the Kings are basically open for business at this point. Pretty much anybody not named Kopitar and Doughty are up for sale, and we'll see how many of these guys get moved out ahead of the deadline as the Kings are prepared to reset and start incorporating more and more of these top prospects they have. I do like a lot of the Kings prospects. They have a lot of guys in there who should be able to take on bigger roles next year. Now, staying in the West momentarily, there are some rumblings that the Edmonton Oilers apparently are very close to inking in a contract extension with forward Zack Kassian, likely going to be somewhere around 3 or 4 years. I believe 4 years is the rumored term, with the value being somewhere between $3.25 to $3.5 million. So somewhat very comparable to like Michael Furlan's contract that he obtained as a UFA from the Vancouver Canucks. Of course, Kassian has certainly come to a lot of attention lately with the situation with Matthew Tkachuk, and the Battle of Alberta has reignited. And Kassian has certainly carved himself out a nice role within the Oilers forward group as well, certainly providing that necessary grit and protection for a lot of their other forwards while pitching in a little bit on the offense as well. So I think it's fair to say that Kassian certainly earned an extension with Edmonton and won't be going anywhere ahead of the deadline, as his contract is set to expire soon. But it's just a matter of time, apparently, before this deal gets announced. It might not be right away, but certainly ahead of the deadline, Kassian is expected to be extended by the Oilers. Now let's jump to the Eastern Conference and take a look at the Carolina Hurricanes, who recently got Justin Williams back, got him signed, played his first game, scored a shootout winner. What a way to return for Mr. Game 7. But unfortunately, they're going to be without top defenseman Dougie Hamilton for the rest of the year. I mean, they haven't announced that he's officially out for the rest of the year, but based on the injury with a broken fibula, I think it's fair to say Hamilton won't be back anytime soon. So that's the bad news. The good news is they have cap space available to them already. Plus, they can put him on long-term injury reserve since he'd be done for the season and go shopping if necessary for another defenseman. I mean, the Carolina Hurricanes were already a team who has been rumored all year to be looking to move a defenseman, but now that's obviously going to change. They might go into acquisition mode here, but then again, they may not, because they do have a lot of guys on that back end who can play. I would imagine guys like Jacob Slavin and Brett Pesce, their role is going to be elevated even more. They certainly have guys like Jake Gardiner, who hasn't had the greatest year in Carolina. Maybe if they can get him to step up his game and give him a bigger role leading into the deadline, see how that goes, more power play time. Maybe they don't necessarily need to try to find a top defenseman who can replace a guy like Hamilton. I mean, the year Dougie Hamilton was having, I'm not really sure they can exactly replace him, but they likely would be interested in making an acquisition to at least have another type of player who can try to do the best they can in his absence here. But Gardiner very well could be that guy. I mean, Jake Gardiner's a former 50-point defenseman who has certainly been known for his offense way more than his defense in the past. So I think it's fair to say if they can get him a bigger role in the team, that they very well might not need to rush out here and make an acquisition. I don't think they're going to rush. They have about a month before the deadline. They can kind of rejig here what they have on their blue line and see what they can do. But the Hurricanes are certainly going to be a team that likely are going to be looking for some help if they can't get it figured out with what they have in-house. Like I said, unfortunately, they do have the cap space to make a bigger splash, and they also have some good young players on both forward and defense who very well could become available if they need to make this acquisition. So we'll have to keep an eye on the Hurricanes and GM Don Waddell. I fully expect them to be very busy leading into the deadline to see how they can replace Dougie Hamilton if at all possible. Now lastly here, I want to touch on the Montreal Canadiens. There's certainly a lot of debate on how they're going to handle their NHL trade deadline plans. As we're getting closer to the All-Star break, unfortunately, Habs have continued to not be winning a whole lot and still find themselves quite a ways out of the playoffs. So it is likely expected that Marc Bergevin very well could go into selling mode sometime in the near future. I'm not sure how much more time he can really take before he makes that decision. I know many had said last week that over the next week or so, as we approach the All-Star break, that he would likely have a better idea where his team was at and a decision would be made. So there's all kinds of question marks around some players on that roster and who might be moved and who might not be. I mean, I know we've seen a lot of talk about Shea Weber and Carey Price, and like I've said before, I don't see that going anywhere. This is not the time for those types of moves. If something like that was going to happen, it would likely happen in the offseason, and I'm just not really sure that either one of them will be leaving the Habs anytime soon anyways, but that's a story for another day. But another player to keep your eye on would be Thomas Tatar. There's been some talk about Tatar being their leading scorer, but his value would be at an all-time high right now, and they very well might be able to get a very solid return for Tatar. That might be something that they can consider here. Once they get everybody healthy, they're going to have an abundance of forwards who can play, so they very well could make some moves. Even a guy like Ilya Kovalchuk has become a major question mark. They haven't won a very bargain contract right now. He's played extremely well, putting up a point per game total during his short run here with Montreal. Now, it's a little bit premature, I think, to be talking about a contract extension, but I'm not really sure that the Habs really need to rush into making a decision either way. I think that's probably going to be somewhat last minute, closer to the deadline on Kovalchuk. Personally, I think that they very well could trade him. If he continues to play the way he has, they would get a decent return. But if you take a look at the Montreal Canadiens, they have a lot of good young prospects and they're already loaded with draft picks. I guess you can never have too much of that, and it really boils down to what they see of the future of Kovalchuk with the Montreal Canadiens, and could he continue to play at this level for 1 or 2 more years? It might be worth keeping him around rather than adding another, say, second-round pick or something into the mix here, but I guess we'll have to see how things go with Kovalchuk. But I do believe there will be a fair bit of interest down the stretch here if he continues to play like he has due to the bargain contract that he's now signed to. There's even been some talk about Jeff Petrie possibly being moved as well. Certainly another player who could generate some interest for Montreal, but I'm not really sure they're going to be in a situation where they would like to move him. I guess it depends on the offers coming to Marc Bergevin's way for the veteran defenseman there. But like Tatar, because the debate is that their value is pretty high right now, and it might be worth moving on if you can get a solid return. But I think those situations are situations worth monitoring, although I'm not really sure that they're going to be something that we actually see get done. It's going to really boil down to the conversations he has and what kind of returns he can get. Now, a player like Marco Scandella might make more sense. They acquired him from Buffalo. They needed help on the blue line. He's a pending UFA. I guess at the same time, they could consider re-signing him as well, but based on what they might want to do with their younger players moving forward, it probably make more sense to trade him and get another asset here in return. They also have some veteran guys up front, like a Nate Thompson or a Nick Cousins or a Dale Weiss. If there's interest in any of those role players, I could certainly see them being moved on here as well. But I do think it's fair to say that GM Marc Bergevin is going to have some tough decisions to make. There's a lot of guys in this roster who could stay and be a part of the solution, and there's some that very well could be moved on here as they try to move forward and start preparing and thinking about next season. It's looking like more and more like the Habs are going to be in the draft lottery here yet again and see what they can do moving forward and get back into the Stanley Cup playoffs. So let me know what you think down in the comment section. Which players on the Habs do you think Marc Bergevin should be looking to trade ahead of the NHL trade deadline? And do you think for sure they will indeed be sellers, or can they climb their way back into the playoffs and be this year's version of the St. Louis Blues? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and we'll continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, turning on your notifications, and checking out our membership features as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I will catch you next time.